Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on from where you're joining us today. My name is Ashima Sinha. I'm a senior research economist at the Institute for Women's Policy Research and co-chair of IFE's Online Events Committee. And on behalf of the committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Reshaping Global Rules: What Can Feminist Economics Contribute to Global Tax Governance? The event is being co-organized by IFE and a group of tax justice advocates and experts, including ICRICT, ActionAid, WeDo, Tax Justice Network, GIESCR, MENA Fem Movement, CESR, and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. You can find some of the full forms in the chat as well. Before we get started, I wanted to provide some friendly reminders for you all. Today's event will run for 90 minutes and will be recorded and posted on IFE's YouTube page afterwards, where you can also find all of our past events. As this is a Zoom call and not a webinar, a friendly reminder to please keep yourselves muted. This event will be held in English and there is Spanish interpretation available, so you can find that by using the interpretation icon, the globe icon on the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. Today, we'll have broadly 2 rounds of sub-panel dialogue, which will be followed by a facilitated breakout discussion. Please also feel free to put questions and comments and share any resources you have throughout the chat during the meeting. And I also want to give a little bit of the background before we move on. So this event, as I said, is co-organized by IFE and a group of tax justice experts, and it's actually feeding directly into a pre-event that's hosted by the same set of organizers, and it will be taking place in advance of the IFE conference in Cali on 8th of July from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. local time. The goal for today's event, on the other hand, is really to kickstart that conversation, and we'll dive deep into the interrelations of gender equality, global tax governance, and the ongoing UN negotiations. Today's event really aims to offer us a space for collective inquiry into how feminist economics can contribute to fundamentally reshaping this debate on global tax governance. We'll identify the key pressure points in the current negotiations and build the intellectual and political bridges needed to ensure the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, the UNFCITC, that becomes a tool for redistribution, repair, and transformative change. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. The first group will be featuring James Hines, Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, USA, and also IFE's Chair of the Development Committee. Corina Rodrigo Enriquez, feminist economist and researcher at CONICET, National Council for Scientific and Technical Research, and at CIEPP, Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Public Policy in Argentina. We have Luisa Nassif, assistant professor in the Institute of Economics at the University of Campinas, Brazil, also co-director of Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequalities, MAGI, and IFE's Board of Directors. The second sub-panel will feature Grace Namugambe, Economic Justice and Rights Officer at FemNet, African Women's Development and Communication Network, and Laila Latif, Chair of the Board Tax Justice Network and co-founder of the Committee on Fiscal Studies. And finally, I'll also like to introduce our moderators for today, Shireen Talat, Director and founder of MENA Fem, Movement and Economic Development and Ecological Justice, and Katie Tobin, Director of Program at Women's Environment and Development Organization, they'll be moderating these 2 sub-panels as well as take over the breakout facilitation discussion. Thank you so much, and over to you, Shireen and Katie.
Thanks a lot, Ashima, and I want also to say that we have interpretation to Spanish and English, so feel free to move between them if needed. From what already Ashima mentioned and why we're meeting today, as feminist economists, we understand that economic systems are never neutral. The rules governing debt, trade, finance, and taxation are deeply political. They shape who has access to resources, whose labor is valid, who bears the cost of crisis, and who has power in economic decision-making. When we discuss international taxation, we are not simply discussing tax rates or technical rules. We are discussing the distribution of power and wealth within the global economy. The current international tax architecture emerged from a global economic order shaped by a colonial extraction and continue to reflect profound inequalities between countries. And for decades, decision making has been controlled and centered in forms where the majority of the global South countries had limited influence over the rules of that governed them. These rules have enabled profit shifting by multinational cooperation, tax avoidance by the ultra wealthy, and large scale illicit financial flows. The result is a massive transfer of wealth away from countries that urgently need resources to invest in public services, social protection, climate action, and care systems. From a feminist perspective, this matters because the consequences are never gender neutral. When governments lose revenue, they often turn to austerity, indirect taxation, borrowing, and spending cuts. These measures are definitely affecting women in the first place and marginalized communities. Public service became less accessible, care responsibilities shift back into households, and women absorb the burden through unpaid and underpaid labor. International debt is also part of the story. We cannot speak about this global economical architecture without speaking about how debt is impacting us on daily basis. Across many countries in the global south, rising debt services obligation are consuming public budgets. Governments are often spending more on debt repayment than on health, education, or social protection. And inability to mobilize fair and progressive taxation further deepens the gap and creating a vicious cycle of debt austerity and inequality. At the same time, we're living through an overlapping crisis: debt, climate, growing inequality, conflict, war, and democratic backsliding. Yet the resources exist. The issue is not scarcity. The issue is how wealth is generated, extracted, and hidden and distributed. This is why the ongoing negotiation of the United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation are so significant. For the first time, there is an opportunity to move global tax governance into more democratic and inclusive space where all countries can participate on a more equal footing. So for feminist economists, the question is not only how much revenue can be raised. The question is what kind of economic system we are building. Our tax system reinforcing inequality, constraining wealth, and extractive models of development, or can they become tools of redistribution, repair, accountability, and social justice? And on that framing, I want to move to our panelists for our mini panel, the first part of our event today, with different questions. And I will start with why we are here today, why international taxation is a feminist issue, and particularly necessary to look at it from a feminist lens. And I want to start with you, James.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You have 5 minutes.
I
And
got it. Well, I'd like to start by saying why I think tax justice matters from a feminist perspective. Concerns such as tax havens, transfer pricing, debt finance, illicit flows, and tax evasion, they're all facilitated by globalization. And these topics are going to be discussed in greater detail a little bit later on in the webinar. But they all have a common outcome. They reduce tax contributions to public revenues by political and economic elites. And we can make one immediate observation that men tend to dominate political and economic elites, so that these dynamics in themselves exacerbate gender inequalities in income. But feminist economists have pointed out a much deeper and a much more profound set of connections. And these connections begin with the acknowledgement that the wealth and income of the political and economic elites ultimately depends on the labor, the know-how, and the creativity of the human beings that populate the economy. But feminist economists raise a really important question. Where do these human beings actually come from? Feminist economists have repeatedly shown that it takes an enormous amount of time and money to produce a human being, and that economic elites benefit from this process. Women's unpaid labor constitutes an essential economic contribution, yet is often left unrecognized and undervalued. Specialization, this type of specialization in unpaid work is perhaps the most important structural source of gender equality, economic inequality based on gender. So just take a moment and let's consider traditional patriarchal arrangements with regard to the gender division of labor. Women specialize in unpaid reproductive labor, which disadvantages them and exposes them to heightened risks. Men specialize in paid work. This is the male breadwinner model. In this arrangement, along with the unpaid work of women, a portion of the income that men earn is used to support households and families. In the language of economics, we would call this money a private transfer payment. The unpaid work that women do is also a type of transfer, but it's a transfer of time rather than money. And taxes, taxation is also a type of transfer of payment. But in this case, it's a public transfer payment. It's a transfer from individuals, businesses, and corporations to the government. And one fundamental function of the tax system is to socialize the cost of reproduction. And this is really one of the foundational concepts of modern welfare states and developmental welfare states, to actually socialize the cost of social reproduction so it does not rely solely on private transfers and the unpaid work of women. The socialization of transfer payments is necessary to produce and maintain human beings, and it's critical if we really want to address the fundamental structural sources of gender inequalities. Even though the social the economic and political elites benefit disproportionately from economy's human resources, the tax avoidance strategies that we're going to discuss today allow them to reduce their contributions, to opt out of the socialization of these transfers, and to keep the burden on women and families. And this is a key reason why the issues raised in this webinar are deeply connected to feminist economics. Political and one observation about kind of the current political economy, and political and economic elites can easily opt out of their tax contribution, while it's much harder for women to opt out of their care responsibilities. And so this creates a gross imbalance in power that allows for the perpetuation of gender inequalities tied to social reproduction. Globalization and a lack of international cooperation limit the ability to respond to these dynamics. This has gradually weakened the ability to create and sustain a developmental welfare state. In many cases, there's been a retreat from the public sector with a reliance on traditional gender division of labor, but also the commodification and marketization of care. Market-mediated social reproduction further exacerbates these types of structural inequalities. And the last thing I'll say is in the past, these kinds of changes tend to be associated with neoliberal policies. But in many parts of the world, if we think about today's situation, there's been a shift from neoliberalism towards a type of economic nationalism, and often a conservative economic nationalism. In these shifts towards economic national support, a resurgence of more traditional forms of social reproduction, including women returning to earlier gender norms, pronatalism, and a rollback of reproductive rights. So that's the situation that we're currently facing. But at the same time that there's a return, kind of a retreat from kind of the welfare state and the socialization of social reproduction. Nationalist economic policies, these conservative nationalist economic policies, including tax policies, particularly tax policies, aim to enhance the position of national economic elites in ways that entrench inequalities and vast power differentials. So I'll stop there.
Yes, yes, James, and I want to come back to you at this point after listening to Corina Rodriguez, and I'm happy that you're with us today. Corina, I mean, with what James already mentioned, the system was built on unfair, just ideology. So from your perspective, why we need why international taxation is a feminist issue and why it's supposed to be from the first beginning from a feminist lens. So the floor is yours, Corina.
Thank you, Shireen, and thanks to all involved in organizing this meeting. I will speak in Spanish, taking advantage that there is interpretation. So if you go to the button, those who need interpretation, voy a hablar en español. Bueno, mi primera respuesta sería, ¿qué asunto no es feminista, no? La economía internacional, la arquitectura financiera global hace parte del sistema económico y el sistema político internacional y como tal nos interesa y nos afecta como personas, como mujeres, como economistas. Y dado que la economía feminista tiene un programa político de transformación, me parece que es muy importante entender el funcionamiento de la arquitectura financiera y de tributación internacional como un elemento clave de aquellos que tenemos que modificar. Em, como ya lo dijo Shirin y también James, las reglas tributarias internacionales hacen parte, por supuesto, de la economía internacional y en tal sentido son determinantes o por lo menos tienen relevancia en las decisiones de inversión y por ende en las posibilidades de generación de empleo, de generación de ingresos y a su tiempo de generación de recaudación para los estados. Son determinantes de los flujos financieros internacionales. Se vinculan las reglas tributarias internacionales con la arquitectura financiera internacional, con las reglas del comercio internacional, con las formas que adoptan las cadenas globales de valor. Eh, y como ya fue dicho, las reglas que hoy gobiernan esta arquitectura internacional siguen patrones colonialistas, siguen siendo decididas por un grupo pequeño de países económicamente poderosos em, y hacen que o permiten la persistencia de flujos financieros que desde la perspectiva feminista y en similitud con la mirada de otras visiones heterodoxas, denominamos flujos financieros ilícitos, que pueden ser legales o ilegales, muchos de los cuales son derivados de la evasión tributaria, de la elusión tributaria y de los abusos tributarios. La globalización, la liberación de los flujos de comercio y de capital han provocado con esta estructura internacional algo así como una carrera hacia la baja de los estándares tributarios, ¿no? Y esta carrera hacia la baja de los estándares tributarios ha afectado en mayor medida a los países del sur global, eh, que compiten por la atracción de capital desde estructuras económicas con mercados más pequeños, con infraestructura económica insuficiente, con mercados de capitales más débiles, con estados más limitados en su capacidad económica y con problemas de competitividad. Y esta situación de desventaja de los países del sur global se ve agravada por la digitalización de la economía y por la expansión, por lo tanto, de mecanismos digitales que funcionan como soporte de las transacciones y que resultan cada vez más opacos y más difíciles de monitorear y seguir por parte de los estados, que a su vez se vuelven dependientes de algo que podemos llamar el tecnopoder, ¿no? De esta media docena de grandes magnates tecnológicos, dueños de la tecnología con la cual los estados deberían poder monitorear y perseguir estas transacciones. Entonces esto hace un combo bastante fatal que tiene implicancias muy claras, varias de las cuales ya fueron mencionadas. Básicamente reducen el espacio fiscal para los países. Como decían, esto es una disputa política, es una disputa por los recursos. Y esta circunstancia hace que se reduzca la posibilidad de que los países, particularmente los países del sur global, se apropien de los recursos que les pertenecen. Esto limita la autonomía de política económica y esto me parece que es bastante determinante de la forma que tienen y que les resulta difícil de cambiar de los propios modelos de desarrollo. Estas estructuras, esta carrera hacia la baja de los estándares tributarios, esta dificultad de los estados del sur global para tener autonomía en su toma de decisión de política económica es muy favorable a la persistencia de modelos de desarrollo extractivistas que afectan claramente o amenazan la sostenibilidad de la vida. Eh, Todas estas circunstancias profundizan las brechas de desigualdad y me parece, y con esto cierro, que básicamente la cuestión de la tributación internacional es un tema feminista porque es un tema sistémico. Hay un vínculo sistémico entre la gobernanza fiscal internacional y la justicia de género. Eh, la persistencia de los flujos financieros ilícitos y las dificultades de los estados para captar estos recursos impone estructuras tributarias más regresivas en los países fundamentalmente del sur global, que incrementan la desigualdad socioeconómica y la desigualdad de género, disminuyen los recursos para la provisión pública, mercantilizando la vida, mercantilizando el acceso a los bienes y servicios más básicos como la salud, la educación, la propia alimentación, favorece modelos de desarrollo extractivos que, como decía, atentan contra la sostenibilidad de la vida y recuperó algo que decía Sherin, imponen también condiciones de persistencia de los problemas de endeudamiento. Cuando no podemos, cuando los estados no pueden captar recursos para financiar sus gastos, deben recurrir al endeudamiento y la deuda va cobrando vida en sí misma y transformándose en otro de los rasgos sistémicos que las feministas queremos transformar.
Yes, thanks a lot, Corina. It is a vicious circle that it doesn't come to an end under this system. And on this, I want to go to Louisa Nassif. Louisa, it's very important also to hear from your perspective, the lens that we need to adopt for dealing with this global economic architecture, but also why it is important to deal with tax as a feminist issue. The floor is yours, Louisa.
Thank you so much. Always difficult to go after Corina, but I'll try. I think I'm going to be saying a little bit the same as both James and Corina said, but from a slightly different perspective. And I'm going to start from a somewhat microeconomic perspective because I've been teaching microeconomics. So if we take like some of the core tenets of feminist economics is highlighting the social aspects of economics, right? So we have this critique to the individualistic lenses we have in economics, and part of this has to do with many of the problems that we have will have is externalities, positive externalities, or public goods aspects to it. So we take care, for example, or health, or the environment. All of those are things that actually we need to find a somewhat social pact. You can't hear me? Someone says they can't hear me. You can?
No, we can.
We can hear
Okay.
you clearly, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, someone put on the chat. Good. So we need to have a somewhat social pact to decide how we're going to be sharing the costs of organizing those things that have such big social impacts or are public goods or have positive externalities. And what we've been doing is that the social pact that we've been relying on to organize care has been that some are going to be expropriated and others will be some will be expropriating and others will be expropriated. So we've been relying on tacit pacts such as racism, patriarchy, and so on to sustain an organization of something that is completely irrational, so to say. And this goes in levels. So it will be in the level of the household with extremely unequal division of labor within the household, with men really adding very few hours or mental, I don't know, energy to organize how care is going to be organized within a community, in a country, and also globally. So in all of these levels, we see these layers of expropriation of some by others. The tax system is part of the structure that is going to enable this expropriation in every single level of this. So what we would need is to think, and then I usually bring fiscal policy into this as a whole, because you can think of fiscal policy as an explicit social pact that as a society we have decided on to organize all of these things that we need to organize socially, that basically decides or explicitly says these are the things that we're going to provide publicly and this is how we're going to pay for it. So this is who is going to pay for those and how we're going to organize that. And this the problem is that instead of actually becoming a tool of organizing socially what we need to organize socially, taxation became a tool to feed accumulation and this expropriation. And a new view of fiscal policy, which sees fiscal policy simply as a matter of debt management, became an economic enabling discourse. So you take austerity as the way we've organized fiscal policy now, and this is a discourse that has also fed into this possibility of using taxation as an expropriation tool. So feminist economics is going to be related to this both on a more political level as a liberating discourse to think that we need to really fight against all of this expropriating tools. And because restructuring tax is a necessary condition now to finance care policies within this very limited and tight fiscal space that our economies have been put on. So many of us, this is my case, I entered fiscal policy and specifically the taxation arena coming from someone that is trying to think, how do we finance public care policies? This is how I'm led to that. And then I found this very powerful network of feminist economists around Global South, Corina is part of that, that have been fighting for this and looking to this alliance. So, and I'm gonna give an example. There is this one graph that I find very powerful that Sergio Taparo from the Tax Justice Network always uses. So he puts on a graph the countries that are seen to be corrupt. So this vision of what is corruption, and this is all on the Global South, and the countries that have the tax abuses. So he put taxes abuses versus this idea of this is corrupt in the same graph, and the enabling of all of that is in the global north. All of the tax abuses are in the global north. So taking that perspective, when you look, for example, into the welfare state in Latin America and compare it to Europe, because it's very common to look into Europe and think this is what we want to have. And usually the discourse is going to be, well, corruption in Latin America doesn't allow us to have the welfare system that we have in Europe. And it kind of completely switches the way you're looking into that. And you start thinking of this as actually the welfare state in Europe is enabled by expropriation for Latin America from a very institutionalized tool. So really restructuring the tax system is a way that we would be able, and then here I'm with Corina, because one way of thinking of this is that our fiscal space has been tighter and tighter and tighter because we don't have a huge tax base in Latin America. Have a very small tax base due to inequality, due to also political issues. So, for example, if we're taxing the richest at a very low level, on top of only taxing in Brazil, for example, we were taxing 20% of the population. Now we're taxing even less because of the new tax revision that we had. They increased on the top to release on the bottom, but inequality also means that there is very few people that are going to be able to pay for that bill, to share those social costs, and there is a bigger amount of people that actually need to rely on that welfare system. And we don't change that by just really taxing within the borders the welfare. We have to change that by also restructuring the international taxation system. I'm gonna stop at that for now.
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you.
Thank you, Louisa. That was very, very important and to the point, and make me think about a discussion that we lately, actually we had it today in the morning when we're speaking about how this system is putting us in the global south in a very vulnerable position, because it's not only the vicious debt circle, is not only the colonial history. This all the package created layer of inequalities and layers of uh, uh, burdens, like corrupted governments, that we have to unfold to be able to go to the core of justice from our perspective. On that, I want to go back to James. Quickly, we're all going to have from 3 to 4 minutes intervention because of the time, but the discussion is very interesting. So going back to you, James, on that, in this time of crisis, why it is important to have this lens in the moment of crisis, in the global economical, social, and environmental crisis.
Well, I think it's gotten to a critical point around the world in terms of the attacks on the state, the attacks on welfare states, and kind of the undermining of kind of all the interventions that have been built up to try to begin to address some of these systemic structural inequalities. And we're at a stage, where tax policies in one country can have a dramatic effect in the global north. Tax policies in the global north can have a dramatic effect elsewhere. And we have a complete lack of global cooperation. I mean, the most obvious example of this is the Trump administration's tariff policies. Tariffs are a form of taxation. And it's having and it's raising a lot of money for the United States, but on the back of countries from the global south that are trying to export. And often these export sectors, the workforce of these economic sectors are dominated by women as a source of kind of relatively low wage labor. So the tax policies of the U.S. are directly impacting women workers globally through this mechanism. And so we have these unilateral policies that are being adopted by the global north within all kind of the structural inequalities and the colonial heritage, and kind of the post-colonial interventions. We can all think of Venezuela for instance, that currently exist. And I think the level of international cooperation is around these issues is kind of at an all-time low, partly because of the rise of very nationalistic economic policies in the U.S., yes, but also Argentina, in India, and other places, not only in the global north. But when countries, in large influential countries, are adopting very nationalistic policies, it makes international cooperation even harder. And we see this with kind of the real rollback of the UN and the funding for the UN and any types of institution for economic cooperation. So this conversation today about how to actually facilitate international cooperation in a way that recognizes, these the colonial and structural inequalities is really timely. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy conversation to have right at this moment in time, but it's an essential one.
Thank you, James. James, and yes, it's very, very important point and very important conversation, timely, but unfortunately we're all running of time. So also in a couple of minutes, Corina, I want to hear your final notes on our topic.
Okay, I'll do it in Spanish again. Yo creo que es importante que mantengamos nuestro lente feminista para que los cambios vayan en el sentido que queremos, en un sentido de mayor justicia, en un sentido de organizar una economía para la sostenibilidad de la vida. En este sentido, creo que una lente feminista lo que propone es justamente un cambio sistémico. Una lente feminista lo que propone es justamente evitar que en esta materia avancen miradas que lo que ejercitan es más bien el llamado pink washing. No se trata de un sistema tributario que favorezca que las mujeres se incorporen en el e-commerce, sino que se trata de un cambio sistémico. Creo que la lente feminista es necesaria porque esta discusión sobre la tributación internacional involucra también una discusión sobre el Estado, sobre el rol del Estado, sobre las responsabilidades del Estado y las capacidades que tiene que tener para llevar adelante esas responsabilidades. Y en ese sentido creo que es importante también entender desde una lente feminista a las reglas fiscales y tributarias como herramientas de derechos humanos y como herramientas fundamentalmente de redistribución del poder. En ese sentido, y cierro con esto, creo que es muy importante que el programa feminista en esta materia apoye mecanismos de establecimiento de reglas internacionales más democráticos, alejarse de la OECD como el establecedor de las reglas y apoyar mecanismos como la UN Tax Convention. Pero creo que ahí tenemos un gran desafío, y con esto cierro, que es cómo lograr que estos espacios más democráticos a nivel global no se vuelvan irrelevantes frente al tecnopoder y frente al poder de 2 o 3 economías globales dominantes.
Yes, definitely, Corina, and I super support. Louisa, over to you.
Thank you. I think most of it has been already said, but I'm gonna bring some positivism to the conversation. What I have noticed is that this is a topic that really engages people. It's an easier topic to put people together around, and even politically. So Brazil has shown that we were able to pass currently a tax reform that have increased taxation to the rich. Almost no one likes the rich, so it's easier to get people around a taxation, an increase of taxation, or a reduction of tax abuses when we are able to nominate it, when we are able to show it, than other topics. So, for example, I don't know. I mean, dismantling austerity, for example, or the idea that that is a problem that's much bigger. So there is a silver lining to this idea that we need to find fiscal space, and we need to open more fiscal space, which is that it has led people to need to discuss more taxation. This is exactly what happened in Brazil. So because we passed a more strict fiscal rule, we needed to find space somewhere else. So we were able to pass a tax reform that is now taxing the richer a little more. So this has been a way of getting more people around. I found it more difficult to get feminists or explaining why is this a feminist issue, not necessarily to feminist economists, that's a little easier, but in general, how do we engage feminists in economic issues has been a huge difficulty that we've had. Brazil is again passing through a moment where we're discussing a lot violence against women. There is a lot of cases and no one is talking about it from an economic point of view. So I feel that in general, as feminist economists, one thing that we need to be doing at all times is trying to get all of the economists' agendas and tie it back to something feminist and try to bring people to the feminism there, and also look into the feminist agendas and try to bring economics to that in order to try to get a little bit more momentum to push for our agendas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Louisa. Well, it is a feminist issue, and a feminist political lens is very important because this is the perspective of equity and justice, and from how I see it, it's also anti-colonial by nature in its intersectionality. And on that, I thank my colleagues and panelists here, and over to my sister and friend Katie Poppin. Go ahead.
Thanks, Shireen, and thanks so much to the first panel. My brain is already exploding with the way that you framed things and the how much we benefit from exactly what Louisa was saying, bringing together the feminist advocates on the one hand and the feminist economics lens on the other. That's exactly what we're trying to do here with this webinar, as well as with the in-person meeting we're having the day before IAFE itself starts this year. So with the second panel, we're going to pick up on that sort of systemic change point. As feminists with a structural lens, that's sort of why we're coming at this issue, why we see the importance of taxation and the new process to agree and negotiate a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation as a potential vehicle for the structural change that we know we need to see in how our economies and also societies and political realities function. We are going to hear from Grace Namugambe from Femnet and Lila Latif. I'll introduce both of them in a second. And in the context of the sort of the tax convention as the latest step in a process of global South reclaiming of fiscal space, as we were just talking about, but also sovereignty more broadly, governments, like a concrete way of trying to reclaim some of the autonomy that Karina was also talking about. And the process to create and agree a UN tax convention was spearheaded. It's been a longstanding demand of the tax justice movement, of global South economists, of people who realize these interconnections between fiscal policy and economic injustices more broadly, as we've been discussing. But it was brought to the forefront in 2022 by the African group at the UN. And so one of the reasons we as structural feminists are excited by it, even though we know, given the context of what's going on at the UN, as James was mentioning, and the kind of unlikelihood of achieving what's truly transformative and needed in the current multilateral context. But what's exciting about the tax convention is that it is a process that has the potential to actually change the rules of the game at the global level and to answer these longstanding demands of the tax justice movement and of advocates and activists. And as Karina and others were mentioning, in the context of increased climate and environmental catastrophe, to also be an engine for a just transition and for a gender just transition. So we'll talk more about that in the lead up to IAFE and at IAFE itself. But the goal here is to amplify the analysis of global South states, of global South feminists across both the formal academic realm and then the more informal NGO realm in which I sit, and many of us here, and to really, amplify that analysis, learn from each other. I feel very privileged to be in this conversation. So first, we're going to hear from Grace Namugambe, who's the Economic Justice and Rights Officer at Femnet, which is the African Women's Development and Communications Network, for about 5 minutes. And then we're going to hear from Lila Latif, who is the chair of the Board of Tax Justice Network, co-founder of the Committee on Fiscal Studies, among other official affiliations, for about 10 minutes, and then come back to Grace. So a little bit different than how the previous panel went. So Grace, if you're ready, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Katie, and good afternoon or hi to everyone, depending on where you're joining from. And thanks to you all for putting together these very useful conversations. So just before I start my intervention, just to share some observations from the recent negotiations that happened in New York, where we noticed that there was a lot of emphasis, I would say, on high-level commitments and a reluctance, especially to include specific commitments around gender, as well as looking at issues of human rights and the environment. And from where we see it, we believe that for the UNTC to be truly effective, it must enshrine a feminist rights-based approach that promotes substantive equality and avoids discrimination, and also takes into account the various intersectional perspectives. And this would ideally be in response to what has been shared by the previous speakers. And from where we sit, we also believe that it must enable states to fulfill their obligations of mobilizing as much revenue as possible to provide the much needed social services like health, education, water and sanitation, among others, all these that could lead to the full realization of human rights. And we also believe that states should be obliged to ensure that they do not take measures that are retrogressive to human rights and could leave women worse off. And in instances where these rights are infringed, then states must ensure that measures are put in place to redress and provide a right of recourse through reparations and other measures that could be looked into. And then that states should be obligated to participate in international cooperation, looking at other issues such as human rights, and ensure that these are not being infringed on, even while negotiating the UN Tax Convention. So most of our core demands, of course, have been around emphasis on the fair allocation of taxing rights, where we have continued to call for, of course, a more of reliance on source taxation as opposed to residence taxation, which we all know has mainly limited the ability of developing countries to raise revenue. I know Dr. Laila will go deeper into this. And in that instance, while we've been trying to challenge concepts such as that of value creation and call for taxing rights that go beyond physical presence, and recognizing that so many companies are actually carrying out their economic activities virtually. We're also calling for tax transparency, and in this we are looking towards having states include measures that call for reciprocation, because we know that in the past, African countries especially have not had this reciprocated, even when they are able to share some of the information that is requested for, especially by the developed nations. Of course, some of the other demands that we've had have been around effective taxation of high net worth individuals, curbing illicit financial flows, but also looking into effective taxation of multinational enterprises. And quickly, when it comes to specifically aspects to do with gender, one of the things that we have called for is a commitment towards ensuring that fiscal systems are fully aligned with member states' existing obligations to progressively realize human rights. And in this, we're looking out for things like commitments that have previously been set under, for instance, the CEDAW, or those that have been set in economic, social, and cultural rights frameworks, among others. And then we've also called for a clear commitment towards ensuring that national tax systems and international tax rules promote gender equality. And in this, we are calling for explicit gender-sensitive language, recognition of differentiated impacts of tax policies on women and men, as well as the elimination of gender biases in tax legislation and administration. And then, of course, we've also called for a requirement for strong transparency and accountability mechanisms in this regard. For instance, looking at systematic collection of gender disaggregated data to monitor and assess progress on gender equality and tax commitments. And then the fourth demand that we've had is one calling for states to be obligated to report regularly on performance when it comes to implementing some of these commitments. And this ideally is in line with defining national needs, priorities, and capacities as outlined in the terms of reference. And in this, we are calling on for the Conference of Parties, if at the point at which it's established, to undertake a comprehensive review of this at each of its meetings. So those are some of the those are some of the recommendations that we have been fronting. And of course, recognizing that for a truly feminist tax system, it should be about removing, it's not simply about removing the explicit discrimination, but it should be looking at designing policies that close the gender gaps and redistribute the power and resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's been really helpful to sort of concretize the context that the first panel outlined for us with where we are in the negotiations and what the feminist demands are, as well as the global South countries themselves. So thank you so much for those initial remarks. I'm now going to hand to Dr. Laila Latif for about 10 minutes. We are running short on time. So then we'll go back to Grace, and then we'll have breakout. So we'll have a chance to discuss together. But thank you so much. Over to you,
really
Laila.
appreciate that. Thank you so much. I know time is time is of essence, but this conversation is so much important. I'm going to try my best to try and get the message out, especially because I want to tackle this conversation framed around the digital economy, because that is where I think we need to take the feminist demands going forward. And this should also form part and parcel of the core demands we want to make for the negotiators of the Framework Convention to really think through carefully. So just to start off with a bit of a background, which is very important, is the question about why, why is the Framework Convention really important at this stage, right? Because it does 5 things that are very critical. It allocates taxing rights, it's going to establish the nexus, and it's going to commit states to curb harmful tax practices, the preferential tax regimes where we have, and the sort of incentives within the special economic zones that one state offers to attract a base that probably belongs to another state. And it's also about committing states to administrative cooperation, which is really, really lacking, and to strengthen exchange of information and mutual assistance, without which, a taxing right is a right just on paper and nothing more. And also this Framework Convention is to get states to commit to prevent disputes before they arise and to resolve them fairly when they do. Now, there's 6 points that you see on the slide, but I mentioned the 5 points as critical because these 5 points are brought together by a 6th function, which is basically the architecture of the commitment itself. These are the rules that will determine whether a state can sign the convention, can decline its substance, and still enjoy its benefits. So that's the problem of protocols that we're going to be facing. So a treaty, in my view, that gets the first 5 right, but gets the 6th function wrong is going to be undone by the states it was written to discipline. So that's the starting point. So now the reason that we are renegotiating this architecture is also because of the digital economy. Now, the 6 functions that I've just mentioned, every one of those functions, we all know this. It was designed for a world of goods and physical commerce that was built, right, on the idea that a jurisdiction may tax an enterprise only once that enterprise has put people or property on its soil. But the digital platform does not work like this. It serves users, it harvests our data, it sells our attention, and it derives revenue from advertisers in a market where it has no office, no staff, no permanent establishment. And what we are seeing is that the majority of the global trade is now even in services itself. And developing countries happen to be the net importers of them. And we are seeing revenues flow from the developing economy to the developed one with very little or no tax taken from where the value was made. So what we know is the cost of revenue lost from brick and mortar characterization of the economy, but we don't know how much is lost from the digital space. And what matters then is where that loss lands. So when corporate revenue basically escapes, the state is going to refill that gap with the taxes it can still collect.
And these are usually from consumption taxes and fuel levies that are going to fall hardest on the households that spend most on necessities. And these households, they're mainly managed by women. Now, where the gap cannot be refilled, then the social spending is cut first and the clinic ends up closing. So then that work then moves onto the unpaid hands at home, right? So a lost corporate tax becomes, by a traceable chain, a longer working day for women. This is what we're seeing. And now the digital economy cure this at all. In fact, it reproduces this problem. And the first reproduction is the movement of profit. So the platform takes value out of the source market and it pays tax. If it pays tax at all, in a residence jurisdiction, it has chosen for that purpose. Then the second injury happens to be a bit subtler. On an advertising driven platform, the user in the source jurisdiction is not only a consumer. The user supplies content, behavioral data, attention, and the network effects that constitutes the platform's core revenue generating asset. Now, this is unpaid productive input. It is appropriated from the source population and it is converted into profit elsewhere. And then it demands source taxation on a factor input rationale rather than a mere theory of market access. And I want to hold that idea next to the care economy for a moment because the resemblance is really, really exact. The problems we've been seeing in global tax rules, in the design of brick and mortar companies that we've had is the same design, structural inequalities and design problems and fragmentations we are carrying into the digital economy. And the Framework Convention has a chance to actually fix this, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the care economy that's going to end up feeling this pressure. Because in both cases, a fiscal system is always built around a definition of productive activity. And that excludes the contribution it most depends upon. So the unpaid carer and the unpaid data subject are doing work that the national accounts refuse to record and the tax base refuses to reach. And in both cases, the people whose contribution is rendered invisible happen to be women who make up the larger share of platform and gig participation that is even conducted through informal arrangements that carry the revenue while, they're carrying none of the protection that the state can provide. So the digital question is the gender question. And therefore, they're the same question about what a fiscal system chooses to see. And this is why now the Framework Convention is the place to try and close these loopholes because it can anchor the allocation to economic substance through, for example, formulary principles, distributing the right to tax by reference to sales, employment, what's the other thing? Assets and even value that is created rather than by reference to where a company has chosen to place its letterhead. Then the Framework Convention can also help us establish a nexus that does not require physical presence, right? Thereby reaching the jurisdiction where the users are located. And I mean the users in this digital world that we are in, where data is collected, where users contribute the content, and also the behavioral data that constitutes productive inputs. And it can complement that with a transaction value threshold so that a high single value automated engagement does not escape simply because it lacks the continuity of the old rules that, were part of the assumption of what global tax should look like. And then also, the Framework Convention can actually get to make withholding the default collection mechanism rather than a fallback, because withholding operates at the point of payment and does not really depend on the source state's capacity to audit, right? A non-resident self-reported costs, the very costs that a decade of the BEPS project has shown to be routinely manipulated. And also the UN Framework Convention can refuse to import the pathologies of this investor-state arbitration into tax, where you see a pool of arbitrators who are drawn from capital exporting practice who would carry a systemic lean towards restrictive readings of source country rights, and where the costs alone would price a constrained revenue authority out of defending the rights the convention has just granted it. Now, I just want to quickly say something about formula reapportionment, because there's a debate upon this, because some argue, myself included, that formula reapportionment has some absurdity in it, because it really doesn't capture for us the kind of method we want the Framework Convention to try and bring out for us or draw out for us in how to tax the digital economy. So when you think about formula reapportionment, it claims to allocate the tax base by economic substance. But its classic factors are sales, payroll, and tangible assets. Now, if you put an advertising funded platform, right, through that formula, it basically falls apart because the user pays nothing. So there is no sale that is recorded in the jurisdiction where the users, particularly women, actually are utilizing the digital business models. And then the revenue is booked from advertisers who are contracted somewhere else entirely. Now, the platform, it keeps no staff and no property in that market either. And that market could be Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana. So the formula would apportion a share to that jurisdiction by reference to its sales it cannot see, payroll that is not there, and assets that were deliberately placed elsewhere. And it would arrive at close to nothing. So we also have to be very careful in terms of the demands we want to make for the Framework Convention to design Protocol 1 in the kind of method it should adopt. If we're going for formula reapportionment, it's going to work for a specific sector, but it cannot work for the digital economy, and we need to be careful there. And then finally, what should be our main asks, right? And I've put 3 asks there. Public country by country reporting, that is self-explanatory. The other one is on enforceable collection rights for cross-border digital services, where source countries get that enforceability claim in the first place. But very importantly, we need to have a binding definition of value creation in a digitalized economy. If we cannot agree on what this definition is going to be, then that Protocol 1 in its design is going to do a disservice to us going forward. So the proposal that I am having is that the convention must be able to carry its own operative definition when it comes to value creation. And I've got 4 proposals. I'll quickly go through them and happy to chat about this later. First of all, the convention, so when we talk about the digital economy, the idea here are the users and the data they generate. So when we come to value creation, we should say that the user and the data that they generate are a productive factor. It's not a market to be sold into. So value should arise where content, behavior, and attention are contributed towards. The second thing we need to put in the definition of value creation is the place of consumption and the place of data extraction, which should count as places of value creation in their own right. They should not be seen as places of sale. The third is that the definition must also be technology neutral. It should be fixed to the economic substance of what is taken from a jurisdiction rather than to the business model of the moment. So it does not expire, the next time the digital business model transitions or changes to something different. And finally, in the definition of value creation, it must reach the single high-value automated transactions as well as the platform with millions of users, so that the value is recognized by what is extracted and not by the head count through which it passes. So I'm going to stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lila. That was such a wonderful, and you packed so much into such a short period of time in terms of actually translating the asks into concrete proposals within the context of the negotiation. So thank you so much. I think this is exactly what we need to be doing in terms of bringing together the expertise that exists within our broader communities and the advocates ourselves. So thank you so much. We are unfortunately behind time because we have packed in a lot for this agenda. But before we move to breakouts, I just want to give Grace maybe 1 or 2 minutes if you have anything you want to add or respond to what Dr. Lila was sharing or anything else you want to share, Grace. Just 1 or 2 minutes,
I
please.
actually do not have much to add. I feel like Dr. Laila made a very good and very detailed presentation. And I think for me, it's just to urge that we all push our governments to ensure that there's a wholesome look into the various clauses within the UN Tax Convention and how those could impact the marginalized groups of people, and how, and of course, work towards ensuring that we retain our taxing rights. And yeah, and of course, ensuring that the revenue that is then collected is directed especially to social services, and ensuring that women are still not continuously being burdened by unpaid care work. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of us have comments and questions and things we'd like to say. So now is the time for that. We're going to have 2 breakout groups. The breakout group staying in the main room will be in Spanish and maybe a little bit in English. But if you would like to avail yourself of the interpretation and or speak in Spanish, please stay here. And then the other breakout group will be just in English. So the one here in the main room is going to be facilitated by Veronica Grondona from ICRICT and Carolina Finich from TGJN, Tax Justice Network. And then the one that will be in the actual breakout group will be facilitated by Martha Hungley from CESR and Grace Arena, who is currently part of the UN Tax and Gender Subcommittee. So we won't have as much time as we initially were hoping, but we're going to have a decent chunk of time. And maybe what we can do, rather than reporting back after the breakouts, because that always takes longer than we think it's going to, is to just make sure that someone's taking really good notes in your breakout, and then we'll share them with all the participants afterwards. Okay, so I think Myra's going to set up the breakout now. Feel free to jump to breakout the room 1 if you'd like to speak English. And if you'd like to have a conversation in Spanish, or maybe some Spanish and English and Portuguese, who knows, stay here in the main room. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Katie, y a todos y todas las panelistas que han participado hasta ahora. Solo comentar que en este breakout room, el número 1 de los breakout rooms, el que se desarrolla en la sala principal, estamos co-coordinando junto con Carolina Finette de Tax Justice Network. Y en base a la discusión que hemos mantenido hasta este momento, y tal como ahí está aclarando Carolina, tenemos un par de preguntas que queremos usar como disparadoras, pero también podemos aprovechar este momento para comentar, compartir, discutir sobre todas las cuestiones que han surgido hasta ahora. Las preguntas que sugerimos o que tenemos como disparadoras son: ¿cómo podemos construir puentes más sólidos y efectivos entre economistas feministas, defensoras de la justicia tributaria y movimientos feministas de base para, por un lado, influir en las negociaciones de la Convención Tributaria de la ONU y, por el otro, garantizar la investigación de vanguardia sobre este tema? Carolina, no sé si querés agregar algo a esto.
No, solo que, bueno, traer un poco de gracias como para toda la gente que ha compartido hoy, y creo que tuvimos muchas informaciones súper importantes para esta discusión. También como el timing súper bueno, porque estamos justo en agosto ahora por una nueva sesión de la Convención Marco, así que creo que por este espacio será súper provechoso para que nosotras podamos como crear un poco más de puentes, ¿no? Y pensar juntos cómo podemos hacer esta incidencia.
Bueno, abrimos aquí para comentarios. Justamente la idea es acá comentar y discutir sobre estas cuestiones. Si nadie se anima a abrir, bueno, a abrir un poco esta conversación. Bueno, un poco resumir, bueno, ahí Corina veo que tiene levantada la mano, si no, si no iba a hacer algún comentario disparador. Gracias, Corina.
No, para romper el hielo. Creo que quienes trabajamos más en la academia, a veces carecemos de información sobre cómo son estos procesos. Entonces creo que algo que necesitamos para poder reforzar estos puentes es un poco de capacity building, de formación, de información. Entonces, no sé, tal vez pensar en armar un pequeño workshop donde quienes están bien involucradas en este proceso cuenten exactamente cómo funciona y sobre todo que nos comenten cómo funciona en términos formales, cómo funciona en términos de cuál es el tipo de incidencia que se puede hacer y los mecanismos y también que nos transmitan cuáles son los temas claves, los temas más controversiales, los temas que más nos preocupan para una agenda feminista. Y creo que eso puede nutrir una agenda de investigación académica para la incidencia. Creo que desde la academia se ha producido bastante en términos de perspectivas feministas sobre la tributación, bastante menos a nivel de tributación internacional y creo que ahí sobre todo nos falta posiblemente construir las preguntas de investigación claves que sería muy bueno que se nutran desde lo que ustedes están viendo que hace falta. Eso sería mi idea inicial.
Gracias, Corina. Ahí veo también que Alicia, tienes la mano levantada, si quieres hacer un comentario.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm joining from Islamabad, Pakistan, and I would like to just request that since the knowledge base about the International Tax Convention is very, very sparse in a country like Pakistan, where just recently the issue of a gender lens for fiscal reforms has started. So that is the first step, and then the International Tax Convention is like a step ahead. So if there is like a knowledge product, for example, like a policy brief or something like that, which people who are connected to the IFE network can then sort of use to disseminate in the local um, feminist academic circles, it would be good, because I don't feel confident myself to, for example, go and speak at the Center of Gender Studies at my university, um, you know, myself without having a knowledge base. So this is, and I think Corina was also referring to the same issue. So this was my intervention. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Aileen. Sí, creo que esa es una pregunta súper pertinente, muy pertinente. Justamente, eh, bueno, desde ya decir que no, necesariamente no contamos con un documento para, para la comunidad de AYAFE. Sí hay muchos documentos por parte de las organizaciones que venimos discutiendo o participando o siguiendo la negociación. Y también decir que esta es una primera conversación que vamos a reforzar luego en la conferencia anual, donde hay algunos paneles destinados a ellos. Y después puedo seguir sobre este tema, pero antes quería pasarle la palabra a Carmen Capriles, que tiene la mano levantada.
Hola Verónica, hola Corina. Este es el breakout room de español, ¿no? Ya. solo para estar
Sí,
segura.
con interpretación, sí.
Bueno, me gustaría compartir un poco algo de mi tema es cambio climático, y lo que estoy viendo ahora son temas de minerales críticos, básicamente. Pero en el caso de taxes, de los impuestos, lo que lo que estoy viendo en países del sur como el mío, bueno, yo soy de Bolivia, es de que el tema de las royalties o las regalías que los países reciben en relación a sus minerales es alrededor del 3% en casi toda América Latina. Bueno, más algunos hasta el 5%, otros es 1,8 más o menos. Y ahí es uno de los problemas donde la mayor desigualdad se da, porque uno dice estos países que tienen oro, que tienen plata, que ahora que está tan alto el mineral, ¿qué es lo que está pasando? ¿Por qué no se ubican? Y es justamente porque las royalties son tan bajas. Si comparas con países como, por ejemplo, Noruega, para ciertos sectores tiene royalties de hasta el 75%. Entonces, claro, no les conviene a ellos explotar sus minerales, entonces que lo hagan en otros países donde los minerales pagan menos royalties. Y en el tema del oro, eso es lo que yo estoy viendo. Y royalties, me refiero a royalties porque está dentro de toda la familia o el grupo de impuestos y de taxes que se dan. Yo creo que eso es uno de los factores principales que hay que poner en la mesa y empezar a hablar, porque no puede ser que la extracción de oro deje 3% de regalías en un país en Sudamérica, mientras en otros países como Estados Unidos deja, bueno, Estados Unidos es complicado porque cada estado tiene su régimen particular, pero en el caso de países del norte de Europa, las regalías pueden llegar a ser hasta un 30-35%. Y creo que ahí es uno de los principales problemas. No, para mí no es cubrir seguir cobrando impuestos a la población, que es una de las, sino justamente estos sectores disque productivos que para darles incentivos les quitan todas estas. Lo mismo pasa con la agroindustria, que tiene un montón de subsidios en América Latina y eso significa un montón de tipos de impuestos que no pagan, impuesto, por ejemplo, sobre la tierra, otro tipo de subsidios, debido a que si no, no son competitivos. Entonces, si no son competitivos, ¿por qué siguen ahí haciendo tanto daño al medio ambiente? Esa es mi lógica. Si vas a ser competitivo, primero tienes que preocuparte de pagar, generar un ingreso para el país y de ahí ya tu ganancia. Si no, no es ganancia, es sobreexplotación. Y eso es lo que estoy viendo en dos sectores muy claramente. En el caso de Bolivia, pero creo que se repite en la región, principalmente con la agroindustria y con la minería, que uno no dejan royalties, no dejan impuestos, tienen un montón de subsidios y luego quien termina pagando los taxes, los impuestos, es la población que está productivamente activa y obviamente eso genera situaciones de desigualdad porque obviamente los que están más arriba no pagan impuestos. Espero haber hecho mi punto claro y espero que se entienda. Gracias.
Gracias, Carmen. Bueno, veo que Luisa también tiene la mano levantada. Quizás vamos a ella y desde ahí hablemos un poco más.
Hola. No, solo quería traer un punto que no hablamos aún, que es de datos, que también me parece que hay una importancia de pensar más en advocacia también para tener más datos en más países. Bueno, solo un punto muy rápido.
Vale, sí. Bueno, Solo algunas como también pensamientos acerca de lo que Carmen y Luisa trajeron. Y sí, total, una de las cosas que estaba pensando acá, de los comentarios, por ejemplo, de creación de capacidad, ¿no? Que estamos como cómo podemos hacer para estarnos juntos, es justamente este, cómo integrar la cuestión climática con este debate, porque están cosas directamente interconectadas, pero también la cuestión de datos fue, por ejemplo, una de las cosas que hicimos en la incidencia en Brasil, porque era como, ¿cómo podemos hablar de eso si no tenemos datos que son divididos entre, en cuestión de género? Así que sí, claro. Y bueno, creo que podemos, lo que podemos sugerir también, pero tal vez sea como organizarnos un espacio donde podemos tener una lista de recursos o de como relatorios que conocemos para que la gente pueda intercambiar, ¿no? Y bueno, y partimos desde ahí.
Sí, me parece una buenísima idea. Nos quedan 3 minutitos antes de tener que cerrar porque no hay para hacer el cierre, pasar al cierre general de la conferencia. Pero sí, solamente decir que, bueno, como mencionaba antes, esto es un espacio que estamos tratando de generar, ¿no? De interacción entre la academia y las organizaciones de la sociedad civil que vienen trabajando en esta advocacía en Naciones Unidas, ¿no? Y quizás como ya se mencionó antes, la importancia de esta convención es que tiene la potencialidad de transformar la arquitectura tributaria internacional, si es lo suficientemente fuerte para ello. Y y abordar justamente o brindar un mayor espacio fiscal para los países del sur global eh, para la tributación de las corporaciones y los ultra ricos, por ejemplo, entre otros. Pero como mencionaban acá, quizás lo interesante también desde el punto de vista feminista es tener la mirada feminista, ¿no? Que justamente muchas veces es fuerte desde el punto de vista de el rol del extractivismo también, ¿no? El rol del colonialismo, del rol bueno, el capitalismo tal cual lo conocemos, y para también tenerlos en cuenta en esta discusión global. Sí, Carmen, gracias.
Sí, no, aprovechando, hace como 2 años en la CSW justamente había un evento de donde promocionaban la minería como una nueva alternativa para que las mujeres puedan generar ingresos, que me pareció muy, muy gracioso. Obviamente estoy a favor de la igualdad y creo que todas las mujeres pueden hacer cualquier trabajo de hombres, pero no minería, ya, ahí como que cuestionaría un poco, pero esos trabajos que los hombres ya no quieren por miles de factores se están abriendo ahora hacia las mujeres bajo el eslogan, o sea, de igualdad o equidad. Y eso hay que tener muy en cuenta porque si bien queremos que las mujeres tengan una presencia activa y demás, lo que no queremos es que terminen en justamente estos trabajos que son este, durísimos, no solo físicamente, sino afectan a la salud, etcétera, etcétera. Pero también eso hay que tomar en cuenta de que ser parte de la población económicamente activa no significa tener que aceptar ese tipo de trabajos, ¿no? Gracias, eso.
Muchísimas gracias. Y creo que con esto le podemos pasar la palabra a Shima para que haga el cierre, porque para que, bueno.
Verónica, tenemos que esperar que vuelvan los otros.
Ah, ok, eso.
Tenemos que esperar más unos 2 minutos para que vuelvan los otros de la
I'll
otra.
wait for the other breakout room to come back.
Yes, this is what I was telling her to wait. We
Great.
have 2 minutes more, and then we have everyone coming back.
Ok, entonces si alguien quiere aprovechar estos 2 minutos para traer alguna otra reflexión, también bueno, está abierta la posibilidad.
Solo decir que qué bueno que hicimos este evento, que hay mucha sed por este tema. Que hagamos más, como Corina dice, creo que quizás como un workshop o alguna cosa, y que también nos posibilite como tener recursos como textos y cosas ahí un poco compiladas para hacer un workshop y que después estén disponibles por la gente, sería muy bueno.
Gracias, Luisa. Sí, creo que sería súper bueno. Ashima, veo que I see that you have your hands up, Ashima. Does that mean we need to come back, or can we take a less speaker?
We still have 1 minute, so maybe Gislani can, yes.
Sí.
I tried to raise my hand.
We have another hand.
Sorry about that, Gislani.
Yeah, hi, how are you? I just want to jump for the last idea that we need to create a group. We need to be together to boost this UN Tax Justice Convention. And I want to take the opportunity to also give the information that we would like to have a feminist, we will have a feminist economists, those who are committed to struggle about tax, illicit tax, and all of these issues to the women conference that we want to organize in Africa, where we are going to gather more women, more than 300 women. And then I expect that all of this expertise can join to explain to other women why feminism is really important, why we need to focus, what we need to be important, what we need to use feminist approach and feminist lens in everything is going through the world. That is an appeal for all of you. Please join us. Maybe I will leave, if you will allow me, I can share the flyers of this activity with you, and also leave to Kati the concept note. I'm looking for facilitator. I'm looking for those who want Africa and the world to move. So thank you to give him this minute to explain what we are expecting. We have this idea to put together every expertise in Africa on these issues. Sorry, there is a noise around me. I'm in Geneva, and LHC conference. So as you know, we have one topic on gender and transformative action for gender issues. So I'm in the commission, and there is a lot of noise behind. Thank you very much. And then maybe I put on the chat this conference flyers. It's Uelomi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. I know we're running short of time, but just 1 minute for the breakout room. Any last reflections for the other group? Maybe we can share that with the participants and maybe later compile all the notes and everything. But this has been great. Thank you to all of our speakers for such a solid discussion and the excellent kind of valuable information you've shared with us. I think this has been a great kickstart meeting for what we want to do in Cali with the tax group. Very timely discussion again. So thank you to all our attendees for joining us today and for the wonderful discussion. Special thanks to the tax group for organizing this event and for all the great work. As a reminder, today's discussion is actually leading again to that pre-event hosted by the same organizers, and it will be taking place before the IFE conference on July 8th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. local time. If you're in Cali, make sure that you're attending this workshop as well. It is going to again engage feminists in a strategic discussion on tax and gender equality, including connections to climate action, which was something that also came up in our discussion today. So in light of ongoing negotiations toward the UN Framework Convention on International Taxation, those discussions will be again around those things. The workshop really aims to garner collective understanding of how the current tax system impacts gender equality and reinforces those intersecting systems of oppression. It will also spotlight sharp intersectional analysis grounded in feminist academic analysis and moving building across taxation, gender equality, and climate justice. It requires registration, so make sure that your registration is open until July 1st. I'm sure many of you would be interested to attend that workshop again. The tax group will also be presenting in multiple panels at the IFE conference. Again, something for you all to add if you're at the conference there. Finally, please also look out for our future IFE online events on our website and social media announcements. Our upcoming events include an event on June 8th, Pathway to Cali pre-conference meetup, and another very interesting one in June before we pause for a bit the conference and come back in August. This one will be on June 12th, Feminist Economics from Latin America and Caribbean, Tracing the Contributions and Perspective. Again, a very interesting one. Best wishes to you all and looking forward to seeing many of you in Cali. Is there a hand